I'm going to really talk about our next topic, which is folk and fairy tales. So, our central question for the lesson will be, how do folk and fairy tales simultaneously entertain, teach, and reflect the values of the societies that created them? So, the big crux of our lesson will be considering how the cultures that house fairy tales put their values in their fairy tales. So that's what we're going to look at. This is our topic. So we're going to make a distinction, first of all, between folk tales and fairy tales. So folk tales traditionally are passed down orally through generations. They're community created and evolve over time. And the interesting thing is that there's always regional variations of the same basic tales. So that's one thing we have to remember is that for folk tales, they're orally passed down. Fairy tales, though, are more formalized and often feature a magical elements. But one thing to consider is that, just like, okay, folk tales are passed down orally, fairy tales actually have their own authors or collectors, because there was collectors of fairy tales that would put together these tales in such a way that we could access them. And interestingly, often featured supernatural elements like transformations. And of course, fairy tales, just like what we saw with picture books, have clearly defined moral lessons, right? So that's one thing to consider. One is more passed down orally, and the other is more formalized, where they have authors and they're in collections. So this is interesting. We were talking about collectors, right? So, a fairy tale collector is somebody who gathered and preserved the traditional stories. Sometimes they take them from oral traditions and they publish them for wider audiences, right? So that these could survive and we have access to them now, right? It's a good thing they did that. So here's some very important ones, important collectors. We have the Brothers Grimm, which you've probably heard of. And they were these brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. They were German scholars who collected folk and fairy tales in the early 19th century. And they did this aiming to preserve German culture and folklore. And they saw this as being stories that would hold cultural significance and moral lessons. So that's interesting. They wanted to preserve these elements of German culture, and they gathered tales from different places, even rural communities, and sometimes edited them for publication. So that's a good thing they did that. We have a lot of things thanks to these collectors. So the Brothers Grimm, and the other one, important one, Charles Perrault. So, was a French author in the late 17th century, and he's credited with popularizing fairy tales through his story. So, interestingly, too, he also collected these fairy tales, and um, and they were written in such a way that they were in a literary style, making them accessible to a wider audience. Of course, since it was Europe, oftentimes there was the aristocracy that would be reading, right? So these two, Perrault and the Brothers Grimm, we see them quite a bit, and we're going to see them uh, throughout our stories. So, of course, both these collectors, they played crucial roles, and it's important work that they did because now we have access to these fairy tales, right? They helped establish fairy tales as a distinct literary genre, and here we are studying them in this unit, right? And one thing to consider too is that these works, these fairy tales, just like we see in fiction a lot, were didactic, which means that they had a lesson. But the whole point um, of this presentation is to think about the societal values, the culture's values that were imbued in the fairy tales. So that's important thing to consider is like depending on where the fairy tale is from, then of course it would be imbued with values of that culture, right? So some of its functions too. Of course, it's entertaining. But also, like I said, many times it's didactic. It teaches us a lesson, a moral lesson, or social rules. And just like as we saw with the Brothers Grimm, that they did so to maintain the traditions and important bits of identity for their culture. They did it for their German culture. And so too, fairy tales do that, right? They have this cultural preservation. Another thing too that folk tales and fairy tales do, they help to process fears and understanding of the world. Um, so that's interesting too. Just as much as fairy tales can have values of a culture within them, they can also have fears of a culture, which is very interesting, and it says a lot about the culture's values and fears too, and they offer cultural touch points. So, I have some examples. So, fairy tales as cultural mirrors. Just what we were saying, how imbued within the fairy tale is a lot of, the values and the fears of the culture. So, for example, in many Japanese tales, folktales, we often emphasize harmony with nature and respect for elders, of course, those being very important values for Japanese culture. In European tales, many times there's a focus on class, mobility, and individual virtue, as those are important values for that culture. In the African folktales, we often see highlighting of community responsibility and collective wisdom. Of course, the collective and the community being very important values. So that's one thing to consider, is based on where the fairy tale originates from, then it will be imbued with the values of the culture. So, what's interesting, we were talking about, those things that we learn from fairy tales, and that oftentimes they're imbued with lessons. So, we think about explicit values and implicit values. With the explicit ones, they're the directly stated morals and lessons. That word explicit means expressed, right? When something is explicit, it's clearly expressed. There's also implicit values. This word implicit, implied, right? So if explicit is expressed clearly, implicit is implied. So an implicit value based on sometimes like what um like the structure of the narrative and even what would happen to the characters. So if there's a certain character that is embodying a value that is maligned, then maybe something bad will happen to that character. Or maybe on the opposite too, if there's a character that is embodying like values that are being celebrated in the fairy tale, then something good will happen to that character, right? So those are implicit values. Some of them being like for explicit, like honesty is rewarded, and like such as the emperor's new clothes. Or in many cultures, we see that idea, that value of the importance of being kind, right, as an explicit value. And then with the implicit one, implicit value questions like who succeeds and fails. So what actually ends up happening to the characters? What qualities are rewarded or punished? So remember that. Um, values will either be celebrated or maligned. So, what happens to the character that stands for what is celebrated? Usually something good, right? And the same way, the character that stands for something that is maligned, usually something bad. Maybe those are the characters that are greedy or selfish or impulsive, right? And also there's that question of, what constitutes a happy ending, happily ever after in different cultures? It'll be different across the board, right, for the different cultures. So that's one thing to consider. Some examples for that, we were talking about like the idea of folk and fairy tales expressing cultural anxiety. So not only like that what they value, but also what they fear, right? So for example, in a lot of European fairy tales, we see dark forests as being part of the story, an ominous place and representing, wilderness beyond civilization where wolves and bandits lurked, so it wasn't safe there, right? Or like in Middle Eastern tale, we see harsh desert and arid landscape as representing, the survival challenges of living in those environments. But things like social anxiety, for example, in like Hansel and Gretel, we see the idea of famine and poverty, that fear of it, right? Or another one in Cinderella, we see mistreatment by the step parents after parental death. So Cinderella is mistreated by a stepmother and stepsisters, right? Or even that social anxiety and fear of arranged marriages and even female disenfranchisement, which we see across the board in many princess tales, right? Or even things like the importance of boundaries and staying in the right path and not being disobedient, like we see in Little Red Riding Hood as she strays from the path, and the wolf comes. Or even greed. I love this story. I remember reading it. I remember checking out the book when I was in high school, The Midas Touch, King Midas and the Golden Touch. So what happens with greed is maligning that value, right? Or even this one, Pride and Unchecked Ambition, Fisherman and His Wife. Look, here we have one from the Grimm brothers, right? So, as you can see, fairy tales embody not only cultural values, but also cultural fears, right? And anxieties. And here's another one too, like urban legends. We think across the board is like reflects like what a culture fears, right? So, for example, in Mexico, we have the urban legend of La Llorona, right? Which um, talks about, um, you know, uh, this mother who, like losing the child and um, actually kills them, right? And here's another one too, in Japan, which is Sakeona. So anxiety about beauty standards. So, this whole thing, like with this one and the Mexico one, the fear of losing a child and unchecked passion, and this one, anxieties about female beauty standards. So that's very interesting that fairy tales not only uphold values, but also social and cultural fears, right? And unease. Last thing we can consider. We also recognize that there's universal takeaway themes and lessons, right? Such as good versus evil, that common theme that we see across the board is a universal one, or even, change, transformation, which is metamorphosis, tests and trials, which is something that we all experience, right? Also, that idea of supernatural assistance. So, God or something beyond. Oftentimes in fairy tales we see magical helpers, and some culture specific elements we see things like specific cultural values and virtues prioritized. Right, this whole idea of a fairy tale reflecting a cultural value, and it seems like magic seems to be a common overlapping thread, right? And also resolution patterns. So, like, how do stories often end within a particular culture and how it defines success, right? So, I'm giving you a little hint. Our next paper is going to be looking at a fairy tale. And when we do so, we consider, hey, when and where and by whom was it recorded? Where's the origin? From which culture? From which time period? We talked about explicit morals and implicit, right? So explicit, what is directly expressed as a lesson, as a theme? What about implicit values, like, what behaviors are rewarded or punished? Like what happens to the character that stands for the values that the folk or fairy tale upholds, right? And what about character roles? Who are the heroes and villains? And then research too, like cultural context. So what's important for that culture? How does the fairy tales align with that culture, right? And then as we're going to see next time, next week, comparing different versions of the same story, how that reflects very specific cultural values, right? So of course, fairy tales, there's more beyond just children's story. They teach us, right? And they also are imbued with cultural values and fears um and it's such a good thing that we have these collectors that allow us to continue having access and reading these, right? Going from the oral tradition to being able to be formally put in collections for us to enjoy. That's our lesson on folk and fairy tales. Hope you liked it.